Hi, friends. I've been thinking about all of you this week and how we used to casually gather and sing and hug one another. Even this introvert is getting tired of the alone time. This interruption has lasted a really long time. So it's a good thing we're in the story of Joseph, and it gives us a way to unpack what it means to live in the interruption. We're going to jump right into today's chapter. And here's an idea. Why don't you grab a Bible and read along with me? That's the beauty of online. You can pause me whenever you want. I bet my kids would love to have that function. So go get your Bible. We're in Genesis 40, starting in the last verse of chapter 39. Let's read. But there in jail, God was with Joseph. He reached out in kindness to him, and he put him on good terms with the head jailer. The head jailer put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners, and he ended up managing the whole operation. As time went on, it happened that the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt crossed their master, the king of Egypt, and Pharaoh was furious with his two officials, the head cupbearer and the head baker. And he put them in custody under the captain of the guard, and it was in the same jail where Joseph was held. After they had been in custody for a while, the king's cupbearer and baker, while both being held in jail, both had a dream on the same night, each dream having its own meaning. When Joseph arrived in the morning, he noticed that they were feeling low. So he asked them, the two officials of Pharaoh, who had been thrown into jail with him, "What's wrong? Why the long faces?" And they said, "We dreamed dreams, and there's no one to interpret them." And Joseph said, "Don't interpretations come from God? Tell me the dreams." First, the head cupbearer told his dream to Joseph. "In my dream, there was a vine in front of me with 3 branches on it. It budded, blossomed, and the clusters ripened into grapes. I was holding Pharaoh's cup, and I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup and gave the cup to Pharaoh." Joseph said, "Here's the meaning. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will get you out of here and put you back to your old work. You'll be giving Pharaoh his cup just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when things are going well with you again. Tell Pharaoh about me and get me out of this place. I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and since I've been here, I've done nothing to deserve being put in this hole." When the head baker saw how well Joseph's interpretation turned out, he spoke up. "My dream went like this. I saw 3 wicker baskets on my head. The top basket had assorted pastries from the bakery, and birds were picking at them from the basket on my head." And Joseph said, "This is the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will take off your head, impale you on a post, and the birds will pick your bones clean." And sure enough, on the 3rd day, it was Pharaoh's birthday, and he threw a feast for all of his servants. He set the head cupbearer and the head baker in the places of honor in the presence of all the guests. Then he restored the head cupbearer to his cupbearing post. He handed Pharaoh his cup just as before. And then he impaled the head baker on a post, following Joseph's interpretations exactly. But the head cupbearer never gave Joseph another thought. He forgot all about him. Now, before we jump into this chapter, I need to tell you that the story of Joseph is told by a master storyteller. And I think if we could read it in the original languages, we would appreciate even more how the storyteller keeps us on his hook through repetition and echoes by increasing and then relieving the tension, not all of it, just enough to keep us wanting to read through to the end and find out what happens. And today's chapter is full of déjà vu. It sounds a lot like last week's episode, doesn't it? It starts off the same and it ends much the same. And just like last week, as we listen to the story, we hear echoes from previous chapters of the story that, if we're paying close attention, invite us to take a closer look. You see, our temptation is to read through the story quickly, to find out the end, to see if things get resolved. But if we do that, we end up missing these cues that help us recognize that even though we want to get to the happy ending, if there is one, there is something deep and meaningful happening in the meantime. When my mom reads a detective novel, and she reads a lot of them, she often goes straight to the end of the book and reads it first, so that she knows who committed the murder before she reads it. That way, she can enjoy the story without feeling the tension. And honestly, I suggest this method if you haven't read the story of Joseph before. I suggest reading to the end, and then you can go back again and read the story and pay attention to all of the other things that are going on as the narrator tells the story. So, what's inviting us in this week's episode to take a closer look? Well, it starts out the same as last week's. God showed kindness to Joseph and blessed his efforts and gave him favor with the jailer. Again, Joseph ends up in charge. And again, at the end, Joseph is confined in a cell. 3 episodes have ended this same way, with Joseph in a pit. First, his brothers sell him, then Potiphar throws him in jail, and finally, the cupbearer forgets him. There are echoes and parallels, repeats and callbacks, reverberations. And the one that stands out to me in this chapter is dreams. So much is the same between last week's and this week's chapter. We might get tempted to just skim over it and hurry to get to the end. But the narrator includes this little speed bump, this catch, that invites us to take a closer look. Dreams. Like the coat in last week's episode, which reminded us that we've seen a coat before and maybe we should think about what that means, the interpretation of the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker makes us pause and take a look back. Because in the first episode of Joseph's story, you'll remember that he interpreted his own dreams for his family, letting them in on the plan that one day he would rule over them and they would bow at his feet. For some reason, they were not super inspired by those dreams, and those interpretations, along with the coat, became the reasons they sold him. And before we got to this chapter of the story, we might assume that Joseph was not a very good interpreter of dreams, because he's pretty far from living the dreams he told his brothers. He's in jail, and he's pretty far down the line as far as power goes. And yet, in this chapter, it's clear that Joseph can interpret dreams, that he does have God's insight into what these dreams reveal, because he interprets both the cupbearers and the baker's dreams correctly. Which leaves us with the question, if Joseph can interpret dreams, how could he have gotten his own dreams so wrong? Do you see how the author sets us up to want to keep going? Maybe if Joseph got the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker right, he also got his own dreams right? Maybe there's more to the story than the unending cycle of rising up a little bit, only to find himself back in the pit. When my kiddos were a little younger and we would make a car trip, I would often put an audiobook on the car stereo for all of us to listen to. Initially, they always said to me, "You go ahead and listen, Mom. We have our phones, we're going to listen to music or play games." But as we continued to drive, I would notice that one by one, they would put their phones down and take out their earbuds and stare out the window, totally engrossed in the story. This narrator is a master at getting us to put our phones down and to listen. How is this going to be resolved? We have to keep going. And then, instead of resolving things, the tension builds. The narrator makes us wait again. Because it seems like this time, the successful interpretation of the dream of the cupbearer is going to get Joseph rescued. And instead, it ends with him in a pit again. But the head cupbearer never gave Joseph another thought. He forgot all about him. Let's camp out here for a bit. In Hebrew, the word for forget does not mean it just slipped my mind. It means to intentionally forget, to put out of one's mind. The cupbearer has deliberately forgotten Joseph. In verse 15, Joseph says this to the cupbearer: "Only remember me when things are going well with you again. Tell Pharaoh about me and get me out of this place, because I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews. And since I've been here, I've done nothing to deserve being put in this hole. Remember me." Remember in Hebrew has the same action-oriented meaning as forget. It doesn't mean just to call to mind. It means do something, advocate for me. This word, remember, is used many times of God in the book of Genesis. It is used in the story of Noah in Genesis 8 and 9, where God remembers Noah and his family in the ark, and so sends a wind to dry up the water so they can disembark. In the same story, God promises to remember his promise to protect and keep creation with the sign of the rainbow. It's not just that God calls to mind this promise. God's remembering is attached to God actually fulfilling the promise. God will do what God promised to do. Action is attached to remembering. God remembers God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 19 when he saves Lot from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. In Genesis 30:22, God remembers Rachel and gives her a child. And that child is Joseph. As we take a closer look at God remembering, we see that when God remembers, it is always attached to a promise. It is the promises of God and God's remembering them that carry the story along. And specifically, it is the promise that God gives to Abraham in Genesis 12 that propels the story. "Leave your country, your family, and your father's home for a land that I will show you, and I'll make you a great nation and bless you. I'll make you famous. You'll be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, and those who curse you, I'll curse. All the families of the earth will be blessed through you." Joseph hints at this when he asks the cupbearer to remember him. He says, "I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews." You see, Joseph is the great-grandson of Abraham. This promise applies to him. This is not just his story. This is the story of how God fulfills the promise of Genesis 12. This is the story of how Joseph fits into that integrating narrative of Genesis, that God is a God who fulfills his promises. And so when Joseph asks the cupbearer to remember him, he is also calling to the mind of the readers the ways that God has remembered God's promises through the previous chapters and continued to fulfill his promise to his people. How will God do it in this chapter of the story? How will God remember Joseph? Because God always did something when God remembered. There was always follow through. There was always action. I wonder who we have forgotten. Who have we put out of our minds because it's just easier to do life without having to feel responsible to act on their behalf, or because remembering them makes us feel uncomfortable? We do this in small ways and in big ways. When you lay awake in bed at night and are bombarded by your worries and past mistakes, in the middle of all of that, is there one memory that keeps coming back, that sticks out more than the others because you know that you did something you shouldn't have or didn't do something you should have? Who are you trying to put out of your mind and why? I have a few, some of which I will not share on YouTube, but one is a memory I have of being in grad school about 20 years ago. There was a couple attending at the same time as I did, and they were both tall and blonde and gorgeous, and I judged them before I even got to know them. They didn't really fit in with the tree-hugging, backpack-slinging, Gore-Tex-wearing crew at the grad school I went to. A couple of times, the wife tried to strike up a conversation with me, but because of my own self-centeredness and insecurity, I wasn't particularly warm or reciprocal. Now, looking back, I see the situation for what it was. I judged her as too good, not my type, etc., when in actuality, I was the one who was being the snob and the jerk. She was warm and kind and wanted to be friends. She wanted to be a part of things, and she was asking me to come along with her. But I was too busy with my own life and agenda and judgments to even give her a second thought, to remember her. Now, I try to put this scenario out of my mind because I don't want to deal with what it reveals about me and that it requires me to change, to act. How am I still cutting people off and making judgments that aren't fair? There's nothing I can do about that situation 20 years ago, but I can learn to act differently as I remember that time in my life. To remember that I am called to live openly and compassionately, to pay attention to how I put my own things on other people. Of course, we do this in other ways too. We have forgotten whole segments of our society. When we remember or recall our history as settlers in Canada, what does it reveal about how we should act to remember or include or heal together rather than cut off parts of our community? Maybe your work of remembering is reading about our history and learning what actually happened to get us here with our Indigenous neighbors. Maybe it means when COVID ends, participating in events that bring attention to our history and help you connect with and restore a relationship with people who don't have a place at the table. Remembering will require action, which I think is why so many of us do not really want to remember. Who is it who God is asking you to remember? Not simply to bring to mind, but also to act to include. Will you remember them the way that God has remembered you? The cupbearer forgets, and the injustice of Joseph's life continues. It seems like Joseph's life stalls. It seems that God forgets Joseph too. There is another long pause in the life of Joseph. In synagogues, before communities were largely literate, Genesis was read over 12 Sabbaths in 12 sections. And one of the weeks, the story stopped right here. But the cupbearer never gave Joseph another thought. He forgot all about him. Maybe that was the end of the story. They couldn't read ahead. They couldn't Google it. They had to live in the space, in the tension, in the interruption. And we know that weight too, don't we? It often feels like life is just one long interruption. We keep hoping to get somewhere, and we are met with roadblock after roadblock. Life often forces us to wait just as the story does. And along with the weight comes the question, has God forgotten Joseph? Has God forgotten us? Is God going to be faithful to the promises he made in Genesis 12? What will happen to Joseph's dreams, the ones that didn't come true? What will happen to the promises and dreams we hold dear? How is God fulfilling and remembering promises even when it feels like there is no action, even in the interruption? Well, it seems to me that the interruptions are the story of Joseph, aren't they? Without the interruptions, the story of Joseph wouldn't be much of a story. We wouldn't have to pay attention to the invitation or the reverberations, the echoes. We wouldn't have to really listen to the life of Joseph. And I think the interruptions in our lives are the story too. First off, they are the places where our character is rounded out. Look at Joseph. In the first installment of his story, he is full of bravado and ego. He's arrogant and a little mouthy, and we can kind of understand where the brothers' hatred of him comes from. But the interruptions in his life mellow him, humble him, and remind him that he is not the master of his destiny. In this week's chapter, we see a Joseph who has to rely on the kindness of a fellow prisoner to help free him. There's no sign of his confident blustering anymore. The interruptions in our lives are the places where we are given the chance to let go of previously held illusions about our own importance and self-sufficiency. The interruptions are often the chapters of our lives where God purifies our desires and reveals to us the ways that we are imprisoned by cages of our own making. The interruptions are where God does the often painful work of forming us. Frederick Buechner says this: almost as much as this is the story of how Israel was saved from famine and extinction, it is the story of how Joseph was saved as a human being. It would be interesting to know which of the two achievements cost God the greatest effort and which was the one he was prouder of. The interruption is where God reveals and then rehones our character. Like a piece of glass caught in the waves getting polished by the water, the interruptions can serve to round off our rough edges and make us shine. Now, one of the great tensions in the story of Joseph is how God appears to be with Joseph and then seems to disappear altogether. The scriptures say that God is with Joseph, and as a result, he enjoys the favor of Potiphar and the head jailer. And then all of a sudden, it seems like that favor completely disappears. But remember what we learned last week about Joseph's story? There is another story that is actually moving the plot along. Last week, we described it as the story of God's goodness that remains with Joseph even in jail. This week, we are reminded that it is the promises of God that continue to draw the story along. In fact, promises in Genesis are like the dots in a connect the dot that help make a larger picture out of a seemingly disparate and otherwise untethered moments. Having this larger plot points in the book of Genesis helps us locate the protagonist of this story. And guess what? It's not Joseph. It's God. Joseph is not the hero. He doesn't pull himself up by his bootstraps. He does not fulfill his American dream by hard work and positive thinking. He does not manifest his future. It's God who is at work and in control the whole time, even when it seems like God's withdrawn. Barbara Brown Taylor says this: Sometimes the work of God's hand is so evident that you can see it a mile away. And sometimes you have to dust for fingerprints. So, if you are in an interruption, which we kind of all are right now with COVID, how is God revealing to you that you are not the master of your own destiny? What is God teaching you about releasing being the hero of your own story to let God be the hero, the protagonist? What is God teaching you about trust? Perhaps the way this shows up in your life is that you do a super good job of worrying your way through every conceivable situation that might arise. If you fret about your kids or your partner or your future enough, then somehow you're controlling it. How's that going for you? You mustn't have worried enough about a pandemic, because here we are. I wonder what it would be like to just let God worry about the future, to trust that God will fulfill God's promises to look after your needs and look after the people you love. It's actually a pretty radical shift to behave as if this were true, but maybe this is your invitation to learn how to do that. Or maybe God is teaching you that you are not the hero of someone else's story. You can't control the kid, the spouse, the person at the grocery store who doesn't wear a mask. You might know what is right for the whole world, but when you offer your opinions, it comes off about as well as Joseph interpreting his dreams to his brothers. Maybe in whatever interruption you're in, you are learning to dust for fingerprints, to pay attention to the ways that God continues to be present even through a seeming absence. The best way I know how to dust for fingerprints is to remain present in the moment, to not ruminate on the past, if I only had done that or not done this other thing, or to think too far ahead into the future. One way I try to practice this is by slowing down, taking my time, paying attention to each moment. It's kind of like paying attention to someone you love, which might also be a way of dusting for fingerprints, but instead it's paying attention to yourself and to God with you. If you're cooking or working or playing, sink into that moment. Do what you're doing with as much attention as you can muster, and see if while you do that, you find some fingerprints. But the very best way to practice dusting for fingerprints is to practice being thankful. You don't have to use this to deny how hard whatever the interruption is in your life. But I wonder if sometimes the interruption helps us see what we really have to be thankful for. One interruption I am experiencing right now is that my dad has been diagnosed with dementia and is going through a period of rapid deterioration. It is not what we hoped for. We are not thankful he has dementia. It comes with all kinds of painful feelings and difficult decisions. But as well as bringing pain, it is highlighting many things that I am thankful for. My parents' long and faithful marriage, my dad's gentle heart, my mom's tenacity. These are fingerprints. Lastly, even though we aren't the heroes of our stories, it doesn't mean we don't play a part. Actually, we're invited to play an even more important role than being the heroes of our own story. We are invited to play a role in the very redemption and renewal of the world. We are invited to participate by partnering our life with God's bigger plan to keep the promises God has made for all of creation. And this is the irony of the interruption. It doesn't look like God is present because of our circumstances, but because we know differently by faith, we behave differently. We act as though God is present. And this becomes a sign to the world that our circumstances don't tell the whole or the true story. In the interruption, our lives and how we live them have the potential to reveal the plot of the story God is writing. I doubt if Joseph got the attention and favor of Potiphar and the jailer by acting as though his story was over, by acting as though his circumstances determined the outcome. Instead, I assume that he probably lived as though there was hope. I assume he worked hard, he was trustworthy with what he was given to look after, and that he was a pleasant person to be around. He lived out of a different storyline while he waited. Listen to what Paul says about waiting. Waiting does not diminish us any more than waiting diminishes a pregnant mother. We are enlarged in the waiting. We don't see what it is that's enlarging us, but the longer we wait, the more expectant we become. Meanwhile, the moment we get tired of waiting, God's Spirit is right alongside helping us along. If we don't know how or what to pray, it doesn't matter. He does our praying in and for us, making prayers of our wordless sighs, our aching groans. He knows us far better than we know ourselves, knows our pregnant condition, and keeps us present before God. That's why we can be sure that every detail in our lives of love for God is worked into something good. As I thought about us meeting together again someday this week, I felt myself being enlarged with the hope of seeing you all again. It's going to be great. We are not being diminished in this wait, friends. We are growing in hope. God is in the interruption. God is working something good. Let's pray. God, thank you that no matter the circumstances of our lives, you are at work keeping your promises. We can trust that even in the interruption, you are faithfully honing us, making us more human, making us more like you, helping us to understand what it lives by faith, and joining our story with yours. I pray for those who are struggling with living in the interruptions their life is giving them, is putting them in. I pray that by your Spirit you would come alongside them and that you would groan on their behalf. Remind them that they are ever present before God in you, and would you enlarge your hope in them. We pray all of this in your name. Amen. Have a good week. Love God, love others, tell his story, and dust for fingerprints.